The story begins in Mexico, where a young boy named Miguel was living with his mother, Rosa. One afternoon, while Rosa was cooking in her small home, she suddenly got a call from her brother Carlos. Terrified, Carlos told her that a powerful cartel was after him because he had stolen a large amount of their money. Completely scared and desperate, he asked Rosa to find the money he had hidden away for her, telling her to leave Mexico before it was too late. But shortly after the call ended, the cartel caught up with Carlos. Their leader, Mauricio, checked Carlos's phone and saw Rosa's name among his recent contacts. That was enough for him to conclude that Rosa must know something. Without any mercy or hesitation, he killed Carlos on the spot. Meanwhile, across the border in Arizona, a retired Marine named Jim was living out his days working on his dry, barren land. He kept a constant watch over his property, and whenever he spotted someone crossing the border, he'd immediately alert the border patrol. One day, while tending to his animals, Jim noticed a small group of people sneaking through the desert. He reported them right away, but out of curiosity, he began following them from a distance. There he discovered they had left behind a man with a badly injured leg. The rest of the group couldn't carry him along, so they'd left him there to die. Jim radioed the border patrol with the man's location, saying, "This is Handsome. Send a medic, there's an injured man out here, over." After that, he quietly returned home. A bank agent came to remind him that his loan payments were overdue. He hadn't made a single installment in 6 months. In truth, Jim had lost all his savings treating his wife's long illness and had fallen deep into debt. Now the bank threatened to seize his house if he couldn't come up with the money. Jim asked for more time, trying to explain that he just needed one chance to get back on his feet. In the end, the bank told him he had only 90 days to raise the funds, or they would take his house. A few days later, Jim went out looking for work, but the employment office bluntly told him there was nothing available for someone his age. Maybe next month they could find something suitable. Not giving up, Jim drove to a local livestock buyer hoping to sell his remaining cattle, but the price offered was far too low to make even a dent in his debt. Even after selling everything, his problems remained unsolved. Utterly exhausted and hopeless, Jim ended his long day at a nearby bar, hoping a drink or two might ease the weight on his mind. The bartender, noticing his tired, troubled face, grew concerned and immediately called Jim's stepdaughter, Sarah, who worked for the border patrol. Sarah arrived quickly and sat beside Jim, talking with him. Eventually, Jim admitted he was completely buried under debt and now faced losing his own home. As the night wore on, Jim ordered another drink, but Sarah stopped him and drove him safely home herself. Meanwhile, Rosa and Miguel had been fleeing continuously along village roads. The next day, near the US-Mexico border, they found a small gap in a long steel fence. Just as the cartel closed in on them, they tried to slip quietly through that opening. But coincidentally, Jim was nearby and spotted the mother and son passing through the fence. Terrified, Rosa clasped her hands and begged him not to report them. Jim was a bit conflicted, but staying cautious, told Rosa he needed to call the border patrol for help and began dialing to report their location. But just then, Mauricio and several armed thugs arrived and threatened Jim, demanding he hand the two of them over. Sensing the danger, Jim immediately decided to save their lives. In moments, gunfire broke out everywhere, and Jim quickly took aim and shot down one of the attackers. He then pulled Rosa and Miguel into his truck and sped away. Meanwhile, Mauricio and his men gave chase through the desert. At one point, Mauricio managed to climb onto Jim's truck, but before he could take control, Jim shoved him off with all his strength. When Mauricio later learned that the man Jim had shot was none other than his own brother, his rage exploded. Now this mission wasn't just about recovering stolen money, the vendetta had become deeply personal. Mauricio's goal was no longer just finding Miguel, but exacting brutal revenge for his brother's death. While escaping, Jim noticed that a bullet had struck Rosa during the shootout. She was badly wounded, struggling to breathe, her voice growing weak. Gathering her last remaining strength, she pressed a small folded piece of paper into Jim's hand with a Chicago address written on it, telling him it belonged to her relatives. Crying, Rosa begged Jim to get Miguel there safely, warning that if the cartel found Miguel, they would kill him. Moments after saying this, she closed her eyes forever. Shortly after, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. When Sarah learned the full story, she told Jim that Miguel would stay at the station that night and be sent to foster care the next day. The following morning, Jim woke up in his truck parked near the border checkpoint, his dog Jackson sleeping beside him. Then he noticed a familiar car parked nearby, the same one the cartel had used to follow him the day before. Inside his truck, Jim found a bag Rosa had left behind, and when he opened it, it was completely full of money. The moment he saw the blood-stained cloth, memories of Rosa's final, agonizing moments flashed vividly before his eyes. Remembering her last request, he talked to himself, started his truck's engine, and set out again to find Miguel. Jim rushed to the border station to check on Miguel. There an officer told him Miguel would be handed over to his surviving relatives in Mexico. but something felt wrong to Jim. Looking out the window, he immediately recognized the men standing outside. Staying calm, he asked the officer for a few minutes alone with Miguel, and the officer agreed, letting him in. Once inside, Jim wasted no time and carried out his plan, quietly sneaking Miguel out through a side door so no one would notice. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, Mauricio stood calmly, watching right in front of him as Jim loaded the boy into his truck. In that moment, he decided he would cross into America himself and hunt them both down to their deaths. Back in Arizona, Jim stopped briefly at his house, gathering some clothes, weapons, and the little money he had left, preparing to leave. But when he returned to his car, he found that Miguel had run off. Meanwhile, Mauricio and his men had begun crossing the border illegally. The border officer who spotted them hesitated, immediately sensing they were dangerous cartel members, and out of fear for his own life, let them pass without resistance. Jim found Miguel not far from the house and sternly warned him that if those men caught him, they would kill him mercilessly. Miguel understood, and the two set off together towards Chicago. While driving, Jim told Miguel he was taking him to Chicago, but the boy sat silently. Jim assumed Miguel didn't understand his language. Meanwhile, after crossing into America, Mauricio drove straight to Jim's house, broke down the door and searched every room. Eventually, he found some credit card receipts and an old Marine Corps badge. With that, everything became clear to him. Jim wasn't an ordinary man, but a trained Marine, making him an even more dangerous enemy. Mauricio pocketed the badge and ordered his men to set the house on fire. Within minutes, the entire property burned to ashes. On the road, Jim stopped at a gas station to refuel and bought a paper map to find his way to Chicago. Meanwhile, using the credit card receipts, Mauricio began contacting cartel members already operating inside America. Shortly after, Jim called Sarah and learned that the cartel had destroyed his entire house. Furious, Jim began arguing loudly to himself in the car. Suddenly, Miguel spoke up calmly in English, completely stunning Jim. He realized the boy had understood everything all along. Miguel angrily admitted he didn't want to stay with them. Jim explained that what he was doing was for Miguel's own good, and that they were heading to Chicago to reach his family. However, the credit card Jim used at the gas station revealed his location. Within minutes, Mauricio picked up the signal and rushed there with his men. Once there, Mauricio calmly walked in and began questioning the cashier about Jim. When the woman refused to help, claiming she knew nothing, Mauricio pulled out his pistol and shot her dead before leaving. Checking the gas station's security footage, Mauricio learned Jim was heading east. Meanwhile, further down the road, Jim's truck broke down and he took it to a nearby garage, but the mechanic said the shop was closed for the day. With nowhere else to go, Jim took Miguel to a small nearby motel. That evening, for the first time, the two spoke openly with each other and properly introduced themselves. Jim asked Miguel why those men were after them. Miguel sadly explained that his uncle had gotten into serious trouble with the cartel, and now they were being hunted because of it. When Jim asked about his father, Miguel quietly said his father had died before he was born. Hearing this deeply saddened Jim. That night, they were forced to sleep together inside Jim's truck. The next morning, Jim woke up to find both Miguel and Jackson missing. For a moment, fear gripped him, but then he saw them returning. Miguel had gone to a nearby store to buy some food for them. Relieved, Jim fixed his truck and they resumed their journey. Since Jim had used his card for the car repair, Mauricio and his men picked up his location signal again and immediately headed that way. Jim shared a story from his childhood about a trip he'd once taken to Chicago, but their peaceful moment was interrupted when a police car pulled up behind them with lights flashing, signaling them to stop. An officer approached and asked for Jim's ID. Jim calmly explained he had a legally registered pistol and could show the paperwork to prove it. But the officer's behavior seemed suspicious. He took Jim's pistol and said he needed to ask the child in the car a few questions. Though inwardly worried, Jim complied and followed the officer to his patrol car. Once inside, Jim noticed the officer speaking quietly into his phone, trying to keep his voice from carrying outside. Jim immediately realized the man was deliberately stalling, likely sending their location to the cartel. He directly asked the officer how much he'd been paid to betray his own uniform. Enraged, the officer reached for his gun, but Jackson lunged at him. Jim struck back without hesitation, landing a hard punch that knocked the officer unconscious. Jim rushed back to his truck and sped away before the cartel could arrive. Shortly after, Mauricio and his men reached the spot and found the officer unconscious. Furious, Mauricio demanded to know where Jim had gone, but the officer couldn't answer. Losing patience, Mauricio pulled out his pistol and shot him dead on the spot. While searching the area, he found Jim's road map and kept it for himself. Meanwhile, Jim and Miguel were watching the whole scene quietly from a distance. Jim then stopped at a gun shop and bought a shotgun. He called Sarah and learned that the man he had shot earlier was actually Mauricio's own brother. Sarah urged him strongly to bring the boy back safely. Though initially reluctant, Jim agreed. That night, Jim and Miguel stayed at a small motel to rest. That evening, they talked a lot and began understanding each other better. Miguel said that once they reached Chicago, the first thing he wanted was a hot dog. Jim happily agreed and the two fell asleep. A few hours later, Jim woke up and stepped outside briefly with Jackson. But stepping into the cold night, his eyes caught sight of Mauricio and his men prowling nearby. Seeing them, Jim rushed back inside. He quietly woke Miguel and, to divert their enemy's attention, called in a fake robbery report to the police. He then helped Miguel climb out through the window, and the two of them slipped into nearby bushes under cover of darkness. Moments later, the cartel broke down the motel room door, only to find it completely empty. Enraged, Mauricio screamed into the night, vowing to hunt Jim down. Meanwhile, Jim told Miguel to wait in the truck while he went back for Jackson, but he took too long returning. Ever loyal, Jackson barked fiercely at Mauricio to protect his owner, but Mauricio showed no mercy and shot him dead with his pistol. The next morning, Jim and Miguel buried the dog in a quiet spot near the motel and made a small cross from tree branches as a memorial. Shortly after, Miguel noticed the money in the car and angrily accused Jim of only helping him for the money. Jim denied it, but Miguel stormed off in anger. A little while later, though, Miguel came back, and before continuing their journey, the two apologized to each other. Further down the road, they stopped near a small church. Miguel knelt at the altar and quietly prayed for his mother, while Jim stood respectfully behind him. A man approached and kindly asked if Miguel was his grandson. Jim gently denied it, explaining that he had made a promise to Miguel's mother to keep him safe. Jim then called Sarah and explained the entire situation. Sarah urged him to hand Miguel over to the police, since things were spiraling out of control. Jim firmly refused. He had made a promise to Rosa and intended to keep it no matter what. He told Sarah he was taking the boy safely to his relatives in Chicago. As Jim and Miguel pushed on toward Chicago, Mauricio and his men scoured every clue to track their location. Eventually, they found Jim's road map, which had a red mark near Chicago, giving them a strong idea of their destination. Mauricio immediately contacted cartel members already established in the city, instructing them to be fully prepared to strike the moment Jim and the boy arrived. Sometime later, Miguel saw Jim practicing his aim with a rifle. Curious, he approached, and Jim began teaching him how to aim properly, fire and disassemble and reassemble the weapon. Miguel told Jim that when he grew up, he would kill the people who had murdered his mother. Jim firmly told him there was no honor or pride in taking anyone's life, reminding him that his mother had sacrificed herself so he could have a good life. That night, Jim and Miguel took shelter under an old overpass. To fight off the cold, they lit a small fire, feeding it with bundles of the cartel's money to keep it burning. The money meant nothing to them now. Survival was all that mattered. By the next morning, they finally reached the outskirts of Chicago. While driving on the highway, Jim spotted two suspicious men standing on an overpass, watching them. He immediately sensed danger and, to protect Miguel, turned off the main road onto a rural route to lead their pursuers far from the city. The cartel's cars quickly closed in, one pulling up right beside them. Jim swerved sharply, sending the other car crashing straight into a tree, destroying it completely. But then he realized his truck's radiator had been damaged. He kept driving until he reached an isolated, open field, where he finally stopped the truck. Drawing on his old military experience, Jim took up a firm position with his rifle. Holding his breath, he took precise aim and fired. His shot struck the driver of Mauricio's car directly, sending the vehicle flipping violently through the air and crashing into wreckage. Only Mauricio and two of his men managed to crawl out of the wreckage. One of them immediately opened fire wildly at Jim. Jim quickly pulled Miguel close and ran toward an isolated farmhouse. The two of them quietly hid inside a dusty old shed, where Jim took position near a broken window. He told Miguel beforehand that if anything happened to him, Miguel should get out and run as fast as possible. Jim spotted one of the cartel members approaching and gripped his rifle tightly. Taking aim, he pulled the trigger and dropped the man to the ground. Now only two enemies remained. Thinking quickly, Jim told Miguel to stay inside and fire a shot into the air to draw the enemy's attention elsewhere. As the gunfire echoed across the field, Jim quietly slipped around to the other side of the building. His plan worked perfectly. The moment the second man stepped into the open, Jim took precise aim and shot him dead. Now only their leader, Mauricio, remained. Moments later, Mauricio broke down the door and burst into the shed, grabbing Miguel and holding a gun to his head. He ordered Jim to drop his weapon. Keeping his eyes on Mauricio, Jim slowly lowered his gun. Mauricio then forced the weapon into Miguel's trembling hands, pressuring him to pull the trigger. But Miguel remembered how Jim had taught him to disassemble a gun. Cleverly, he had removed the pistol's magazine without Mauricio noticing. When Mauricio forced him to pull the trigger, only an empty click sounded from the unloaded gun. Realizing what had happened, Mauricio quickly pulled out his own pistol to fix the situation. but that split-second mistake gave Jim the opening he needed. Jim lunged forward and attacked Mauricio, and the two engaged in a brutal life-or-death struggle, trading punches and rolling on the ground in a fierce fight. In the middle of this chaos, Miguel picked up the gun and aimed it at Mauricio. Desperate to save his life, Mauricio tried to provoke the boy into pulling the trigger. Jim saw the terrible mix of rage and pain in Miguel's eyes and immediately stepped in, telling him not to listen to that man, warning him not to carry the weight of someone's death for the rest of his life. Jim took the gun from Miguel's hands and fired a single shot straight into Mauricio's stomach. He then signaled Miguel to head outside. As Jim picked up his weapon again, the bleeding, weakened Mauricio pulled something from his pocket. It was the Marine badge he had stolen from Jim's house. Jim took it back and gave Mauricio one final choice: die by Jim's hand or end his own life. But by then, Mauricio had already made his decision. He turned the gun on himself. A moment later, one final gunshot echoed chillingly through the quiet countryside. With the danger finally over, Jim and Miguel resumed their journey and soon arrived at the address Rosa had written on that small piece of paper. Miguel knocked on the door, and when it opened, his aunt and grandmother stood before him. Before Miguel could turn around to say goodbye, Jim had already quietly walked away. Nursing his wounds, Jim boarded a bus, took a window seat, breathed deeply, and closed his eyes peacefully. The brutal fight, the promise he'd made, and the long journey behind him slowly began to fade as the bus moved forward. Jim left in peace, his final mission finally complete. And that's where the movie ends. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video.